Section 8-1 is about energy and life. So before we talk about how our cells use energy, we need to review how we get energy and the different forms that it might come in. If you recall, autotrophs are plants and some other types of organisms that contain chlorophyll. And if you recall, chlorophyll is the green pigment that is in plants. These are able to use light energy from the sun to produce food through the process called photosynthesis. Autotrophs include organisms that make their own food and autotrophs can use the sun's energy directly. Most of the time when we think about autotrophs, we think about plants, but there are also animal-like protists called euglena that contain the green pigment chlorophyll, and those also use photosynthesis to make energy. Heterotrophs, on the other hand, are organisms that cannot make their own food, and we as humans fall into that particular category. Heterotrophs cannot directly use the sun's energy, which means that we have to ingest or eat food in order for us to have energy. Now, if you recall from physical science, energy takes many forms. There's light energy, heat, electrical, chemical, mechanical. There's also kinetic energy. So energy comes in many different forms, and energy can be changed from one form to another. And a way of converting energy in our system is through the process of metabolism. Energy can be stored in chemical bonds and then later released. So this whole next discussion is going to talk about the form of energy that we have in our cells. Candles release energy as both heat and light, which is something you would have learned in physical science. ATP is what is in our cells that is going to give living organisms like us energy. ATP stands for adenosine triphosphate. One thing that you want to remember is the T stands for tri, and tri stands for 3. ATP contains 3 high-energy phosphate groups. And if you look down at the bottom of the slide, you can see what a molecule of ATP looks like. It also contains the nitrogen base adenine and a ribose sugar. ADP is adenosine diphosphate. So notice diphosphate has only 2 phosphate groups. Now, we're going to have to remember the difference between ATP and ADP. When a cell has energy available, it can store small amounts of it by adding a phosphate group to ADP molecules, making an ATP molecule. So what does an ADP molecule look like? adenosine diphosphate has, once again, just 2 phosphate groups. It still has the adenine, which is here, and it still has the ribose sugar, which is here, but there are only 2 phosphate groups present. ATP releases energy, a free phosphate, and ADP when cells take energy from ATP. So once again, when cells take the energy, they also take a phosphate group and ADP. Sugar in ADP and ATP is called ribose. And you'll learn more about ribose at the beginning of 3rd quarter when we talk about DNA. It is a pentose sugar, and what that means when it's a pentose sugar is that it has 5 sugars. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So it has the shape of a pentagon. It is also found in RNA. So we'll learn more about ribose and its role in RNA when we talk about DNA. Why is ATP important? ATP is the principal compound used to store energy in living organisms. And if we're looking at a different model of ATP, you can see where all of the different elements are put together in order to make ATP. So, how do we release energy from ATP? ATP is constantly being used and remade by cells. And we're going to talk more when we talk about cellular respiration, how ATP is used and remade by cells. ATP provides all of the energy for all of the cell's activities. How does this work? The high energy phosphate bonds are broken, and that is how energy is then released. This is called phosphorylation. So the process of releasing ATP's energy and reforming the molecule is called phosphorylation. Here's another way to look at it. Adding a phosphate group to ADP stores energy in the form of ATP. Remember, ADP just has 2 phosphate groups. So we add a phosphate group to ADP, and that gives us ATP. Removing a phosphate group from ATP releases energy and forms ADP. So going from ADP to ATP, we are gaining a phosphate group. When we're releasing energy from ATP back to ADP, we are losing a phosphate group. So the next question is, what do cells use all of this energy for? Why do our cells need energy? Cells use ATP for active transport. We learned about that in section 7-3, moving larger molecules into and out of the cell. Movement, photosynthesis, which we're going to get into detail in section 8.3, protein synthesis, which we're going to talk about in third quarter when we talk about DNA, cellular respiration, which we're going to talk about how mitochondria make and use energy, and all other cellular reactions. Cells have enough ATP to last for only a few seconds. So ATP must constantly be made in order for our cells to function. ATP transfers energy very well, and that's by breaking the phosphate bond. ATP is not good at energy storage. So where is the energy in our bodies stored then? That question is answered with glucose. And if you recall from chapter 2, glucose is a monosaccharide. It's the simplest sugar out there. The chemical formula is C6H12O6. One molecule of glucose stores 90 times more chemical energy than one molecule of ATP. So as we learn more about photosynthesis and cellular respiration, you learn why it is important for us to continually supply our bodies with food so that we have enough energy to survive.